Our talk this morning, which will close out our panel, is entitled The Films of Shane Carruth and Biological Databases of Connectivity. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thanks, Jim. Okay. So this here is a diagram made by a fan of Shane Carruth's 2004 independent travel film, Timer, which attempts to make sense of the film's narrative logic. This is another one, the quote-unquote definitive version. This is a screen cap from a 20-minute video about a 77-minute film that does a better job than those diagrams. This is the comprehensive breakdown of the film. This is another video. This is yet another video. And another diagram. Another mostly incomprehensible diagram. And someone trying to do the simple version. Aww. So Shane Carruth has only made 2 films since 2004. The first one, Primer, was an instant indie classic. It became the new gold standard for low-budget filmmakers everywhere. Won the Grand Jury Prize at Sundance in 2004. It was notable for its lack of restraint in using technical jargon to describe 2 engineers' accidental discovery of time travel in their garage. The second film, Upstream Color, was released to wide critical acclaim in 2013. I'll be just discussing Upstream Color in some detail later, but for now, I'll just quote the filmmaker's description of the film as a depiction of a, quote, worm, pig, orchid lifestyle. Life cycle, sorry. So you can ruminate on that, and we'll talk more about it later. Carruth has also stated when asked what Upstream Color is about that he has, quote unquote, no idea. For an artist whose first work spawned a constellation of internet diagrams, articles, and videos, this sounds a lot like a challenge to me. In this paper, I'll be investigating how Carruth's 2 films, in particular Upstream Color, function as media objects for textual analysis. I'll draw on J. David Bolter and Richard Grusin's concept of hypermediated phenomena, media objects which call attention to their strategies of mediation and representation, as well as some of the ideas that Jeff Bowker and Susan Starr discuss in their book, Sorting Things Out, Classification and Its Consequences, about the permeating ubiquity of classifying and standardizing. So before Primer, a quick primer, if you will, on Bolter and Grusin. In their book, Remediation, they explore the ways various media express what they see as 3 intersecting strategies: remediation, immediacy, and hypermediacy. So according to the authors, media are in a constant process of referencing, absorbing, and replacing older or newer media. Remediation simply describes how media can reference and refashion other media. With immediacy, the goal is to immerse the viewer in the media and erase the experience of that media. Hypermediation occurs when the viewer is hyper-aware and conscious of the act of seeing and of the medium itself. In the book's chapter on film, the authors pay a lot of attention to animated films, arguing that Disney films from the 80s and 90s, was written in 1999, perfectly encapsulate what they call retrograde remediation, which both absorbs and refashions older stories and myths, while incorporating newer technologies like computer graphics to simulate seamless unity between the look and tropes of classical Hollywood narrative, older media like children's books and illustrations, and new visual effects. To illustrate what they define as hypermediated phenomena, they use the film Aladdin, which repeatedly calls attention to itself by shifting its style and tone in accordance to whatever Robin Williams felt like improvising in the studio. Filmmakers knew the audience would hear Williams' frenetic improvisational culture sampling, picture him in the recording studio, and appreciate and enjoy the fact that sections of the film, the animators maneuver sections of the film around him. They state that, quote, there's an element of narcissism about the genie, and therefore the movie, a fascination with its own changing reflection. So with films like Aladdin, or more recently films like Star Wars: The Force Awakens, we see examples of hypermediation through cultural appropriation or sampling, or what David Grusin has called the pleasures of contamination. I came across this book in 2006. It was 6 years old at that time. I already wanted to start adding to the list of hypermediated films. By this time, the phenomenon of web-fueled consumer and fandom culture, reappropriation, the abundance of prosumer technologies had grown exponentially since 1999, giving rise to an entirely different opportunity for the analysis of texts in terms of cultural studies, reception studies, and critical discourse theory. I won't delve too much into those modes of inquiry today, but they factor into how such films as Christopher Nolan's Memento, Primer, and Upstream Color function as texts as part of a larger textual life cycle. The films exemplify the concept of database films as explored by scholars like Marcia Kinder, Vivian Sobchak, Stephen Mamber, and others. These films arguably more cleverly articulate hypermediation. That sentence needs work. They still call attention to their structure and narrative devices, but unlike the genie's shameless and unchecked narcissism, they do so in a manner which cleverly disguises their own strategy. So Chris Nolan's Memento might be one of the more heavily analyzed examples of these films. The protagonist, Leonard, has short-term memory loss, so the structure of the film and its narrative holes reflect his fragmented consciousness. In nearly every interaction in the film, Leonard announces, "I have this condition," to whoever he's speaking to, thus reminding the audience that narrative and plot elements are about to get repeated and reread from notes, journals, and tattoos, which are then re-edited and re-edited as new evidence is gathered from different parties. The entire film is presented in two interwoven threads, black and white scenes arranged chronologically and color scenes arranged in reverse order. The ending of the film betrays the audience's trust in Lenny's memory loss. He essentially announces his own unreliability by admitting in voiceover narration that he knows he's actively rewriting his own history, thus inviting the audience to immediately go back and rewatch the film from this new lens. Memento was released at a time when digital technology was getting cheaper and more ubiquitous, so viewers and fans could use tools like Photoshop and Final Cut Pro to create their own visualizations, re-edits, and diagrams. Moreover, use of the internet for cultural discourse and remixing was burgeoning and only grew exponentially thereafter. Even the film's marketing itself reinforced its hypermediacy. These shots from the 2001 limited edition DVD contain difficult Easter egg games, which would then allow you to see a re-edited version of the film in chronological order. 3 years later came Carruth's Primer. The first and most brilliant formal device Carruth uses in this film is the dialogue, which I'll show a short clip of so you can see it and stop hearing me rattle on, so you can see the actual film in motion. Before his life as a filmmaker, Carruth was a software engineer. The film, which depicts two engineers working on a side project in their garage, did not pull any punches with throwing in as much technical jargon as possible. At some point, you can just glean that something has happened, that the two men have stumbled on a use and functionality of their invention that they had neither predicted or planned. But the visceral way they react to these developments leaves the viewer on the edge of his or her seat, despite the fact that you have really no idea what's going on.
Okay, that's the plate. And I rigged this into the box so I could have some control over the feed to it. I figured it's the easiest way to...
This is just controlling the box.
Right, just the box.
The plate stays the same.
Yeah, the plate's the same. What you do is you gradually feed it to... Okay, you hear that? How it's, see, I'm not touching it anymore. It's growing with its own momentum. It's like a feedback loop, and it just regulates itself. And what you do is when it gets there, you bring it back, and there you go, it coasts. It's stable, it stays like that.
So it works. Yeah, it does. Is that like 10%? Jeez.
Yeah, it knocks another couple points out too by the time it reaches the peak. You may want to come over here and take a look at this.
Okay, what am I looking at?
What are we pulling out of the batteries?
I don't know, probably 24 volts. I mean, no more than that, right?
Okay.
Well, so your meter's jacked up.
That's what I figured. So I tried 3 others. I got the exact same thing. I spent all last night...
What was it?
I don't know. I spent all last night in a 2-hour lunch break today just double checking everything.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, we're missing something. You know, there's something wrong here. We're not pulling out more than we're putting in.
Slightly more.
Well, yeah, whatever. It's not like a volt and a half more than we're putting in. I mean, it's probably the batteries. They're cheap batteries, you know, probably not regulated right. It is weird, though.
You want to see something weirder?
Okay, so just about as vaguely as in that clip, Primer portrays the accidental discovery of time travel. Two men attempting to control their discovery and their environment. There are different approaches towards enacting that control. It also contains a healthy Shakespearean dose of betrayal, suspicion, and sabotage, which is all very impressive considering it's a film made for $7,000 by a newbie auteur with no filmmaking experience. Critical dialogue about Primer often revolved around the notion of whether audiences are able to let go and accept the idea that Carruth never wanted an audience to fully understand every element of his plot, or whether he was inviting the audience to go digging and excavate some hidden truth. As critic Jonathan Romney has written, you might say that Carruth likes to set up systems that develop autonomously and potentially uncontrollably, fueled by their own dynamism. Then it seems the question is how much Carruth and the viewer gets to master these systems as opposed to them just playing out. Excavation attempts also abounded in Carruth's second and only other feature film, Upstream Color, which was not released for another 9 years. The film is rife with signs, references, code, and a complex remixing of those things within a slow-paced, almost poetic tonal framework. This is, I'm going to show you the teaser trailer in a minute. It's edited like a trailer, but I just want to make the note that it's a lot of the sequences in the films are about like the trailer. They're sort of, fluid and tonally sort of abstract, like an experimental film. Like Primer, it makes use of obfuscation through dialogue, formal elements such as framing and editing, and most importantly through its presentation of narrative truth. In a review of the film for Sight and Sound, Vivian Sobchak says that the film's narrative movement is not driven by continuity, editing, or montage meant to further the specificity and sequential logic of the story. Rather, it's driven by ellipses, by discrete sequences that condense moments in time, and the associational and rhythmic logic of poetry.
I have to apologize. I was born with a disfigurement where my head is made of the same material as the sun.
Pretty straightforward, right? All right, so almost any analysis of upstream color has to include a very succinct description of the plot. I'm going to try and make this brief in 2 minutes. Try and follow along. Orchid hunters find a rare blue orchid that contains a type of parasitic worm which control those who ingest them. A man named the Thief targets Chris, a woman named Chris, and makes her ingest one. He controls her under hypnosis for 3 days and drains her bank account and leaves. Chris tries to dig out the worm, which is growing inside of her. A man named the Sampler lures Chris to him in a field using soundscapes. She asks him to take it out, which he does, in a gruesome display of body horror, and surgically implants it into a pig on an adjacent operating table inside the trailer. He tags the pig with Chris's name, takes the pig, Chris Pig, back to the farm where she bonds with another pig. Chris wakes up with no memory of these events, loses her job, presumes she had a nervous breakdown. Years later, she's a recluse and takes medications for what she thinks is psychosis. She meets Jeff, and they form a strange bond over their non-memory of similarly empty gaps in their consciousness. We also learned that the Sampler, separately, keeps a herd of pigs, which have all been implanted the same way, and he literally samples their lives and experiences through some kind of psychic connection. Jeff Pig and Chris Pig also bond, becoming reclusive with each other in the pig pen, which Sampler tries to prevent. Chris and Jeff try to make sense of their fragmented consciousness, memories, and shared experiences. They become frustrated at the fact that even their childhood memories seem to overlap and blend with each other. Chris feels strongly she's pregnant. Testing reveals that she's not. Chris Pig, however, is pregnant. She gives birth to a litter, which the Sampler hurriedly collects, places in a sack, and drowns. The bonded pigs proceed to panic, as do Chris and Jeff, although they have no idea why. The bodies of the drowned pigs decompose next to a tree, which starts growing, you guessed it, blue orchids. Chris is jarred by the piglet experience and starts randomly reciting lines from Walden, which the thief had made her recite and write out on pieces of paper during her imprisonment, attached to a paper chain, and then throws the paper chain away. Jeff recognizes the passages too. They both regain some consciousness of their traumas, which leads them to track down and kill the Sampler. They uncover the Sampler's vast archive of categorized pigs implanted with human essences. Horrified, they mail each person's file to them, along with a copy of Walden. One by one, the other affected people read Walden and wake up. They gather at the Sampler's farm, reunite with their pigs. Chris and Jeff stay on the farm, paint it yellow, changing their symbolic color from blue to a color of their choosing. The orchid hunters cannot find any more blue orchids, only white. The thief discovers there are no more worms. The cycle is broken. The film ends with a shot of Chris, after some time has passed, hugging a piglet, presumably her new pseudo-offspring. Critics and scholars have made much of the intertextuality of Walden, how it functions as a sort of key or cipher in the film. It's hard to ignore the signifying importance of Walden in the movie, but not only does the thief use it to program Chris out of her own agency, but it's also the memory and recitation of Walden, which allows Chris to pinpoint the Sampler as the supposed cause of her trauma. Despite how tempting it is to fixate on Walden, and there's actually a great New Yorker article by Caleb Crane called Thoreau's Poison, which breaks this down beautifully, and this is actually the thing that got me kind of delved into studying this. highly recommend it. Other critics have dismissed the Walden connection as a red herring. Carruth himself, when asked about Walden, also has de-emphasized its importance. You can see that with quotes like this, it's just really tempting to make the connections and give it heightened importance. Carruth has stated in several interviews that a major theme in Upstream Color is the universal frustration of the not knowing or understanding the forces at play which affect your life and threaten your identity and concept of reality. He sees Chris's confrontation with and defeat of the sampler as very cathartic in a sense, but also very subversive. Critic DJ Pangburn, among others, seems to tap into this theme and talks about the films in terms of viral narrative hacking, whereas others seem to just imply that Carruth's narrative film language itself is programming us, making it part of its horrific, mysterious life cycle. So after passing through these readings and interpretations of Upstream Color, hacking, codification, programming, classification, memory, impermanence, biological connectivity, I was surprised not to find anything which explored the meaning of the sampler's obsession with collecting and classifying human experiences for his own enjoyment. If we're supposed to understand the film as a meditation on unknown forces which control our lives, I can't imagine leaving out discussions of ontology and the human urge to control and classify the world around us. In Jeff Bowker and Susan Starr's Sorting Things Out, they explore how the human urge to understand or control our environment leads to pervasive, ubiquitous, and often invisible systems of classification that we have a moral and ethical duty to unpack because, quote, each standard in each category valorizes some point of view and silences another. They cite examples of the danger of this inescapable tendency in this section in the opening entitled To Classify as Human, how U.S. immigration classified certain races as desirable, leading to racial disparity and violence, how standardized achievement tests privilege certain knowledge skills and silence others, etc. This feeling of the unknown forces controlling us manifests daily as a collective sense of dread about how much our private information is vulnerable to hackers, the government, Facebook. Imagine how multiplied that dread would be if your information wasn't so much in your emails, bank accounts, or browsing history, but in your very essence, your agency, those memories. What if those things that could be pulled out of you, collected and enjoyed by some unknown party who fetishizes others' experiences? I think Upstream Color's greatest feat is invoking the idea that certain unseen forces which shape us also connect us together in ways we didn't see as possible, ways which are more biological, horrifying, and wondrous than simply names linked in a database or as files stored in the same drawer. Or, as IndieWire's Jessica Kiang describes, the movie, quote, showed strange faith that everything is ultimately explicable, everything is the effect of causes, and that those causes could be found out, but the causes are so infinitely complex that it feels like wonder. Carruth fully acknowledges that the science of the film is made up, but that it's not unthinkable there is truth there. Lev Manovich famously states that the database is the new form of narrative cultural expression. Many film scholars have also speculated on the concept of the database film, including Kristen Daly, who said in her essay entitled Cinema 3.0 that database cinema forces the viewer to imagine there could be other configurations. So to close, I might pose the question, what does a configuration of a biological narrative database look like? I think maybe it looks like Upstream Color, which is starting to look a lot like Cinema 4.0. And that's it.